Hello and welcome to the second version of the Packaging Extended Producer Responsibility update. This time we're going to focus on the Recyclability Assessment Methodology and any packaging recommendations we might have. And there's actually been quite a few updates on this week, so hot off the press. My name is Charlotte Davis. I'm a senior consultant here at Beyondly in resource efficiency and circularity. So to kick ourselves off, I just wanted to provide a bit of an update of what packaging extended producer responsibility is. We covered this in the first video, so I'll do this super quickly, but essentially EPR is an environmental policy approach which extends the producer's responsibility for their product or their packaging to the post-use stage. And we know for packaging that we did have a set of regulations that had been in since 1997. And they never really fully covered the cost of disposing of packaging waste. They only really covered the end of the process, that recycling. However, when we've got packaging EPR in place, and we have now, via disposal fees, we will move the full cost of dealing with household packaging waste away from the local taxpayers and councils to the packaging producers, applying that polluter pays principle, giving producers responsibility for their costs of packaging throughout its life cycle. And this will hopefully incentivise reduced packaging use, but also choice and design of easier to recycle packaging. And those regulations came in from the 1st of January 2025. So we're fully now within the packaging extended producer responsibility. So let's start with the obligation that the producers have. So large producers have an obligation in packaging EPR regulations to assess the recyclability of household packaging and packaging that commonly ends in or is commonly placed in public bins. Large producers have this obligation on packaging placed on the market from 2025 onwards, and that's when the regulations came in from the 1st of January this year. So large producers should have started recording this already. Large producers must carry out this assessment following the Recyclability Assessment Methodology, or RAM for short. And the results of this assessment must be reported via producers placed on market data that you submit to your compliance scheme or the regulator. So the results of the RAM are just submitted as normally within your biannual packaging submissions, your data reporting. The results of the assessment, of that RAM assessment, will determine the modulation of your disposal fees from year 2 of the operations. And if you're unsure what that means, please have a look at the first video we've done on disposal fees, which kind of cover all of that. But essentially, it's the payments for the year 2026 to 2027, which is based on market 2025 placed on market data. So it's that packaging that's placed on the market now, and the fees will be starting to apply next year. Full details on how the fees will be modulated have been published by Pack UK for the first instance this week. So I go on to talk about that in a minute, but we are expecting the in-depth policy statement in June 2025. So the Recyclability Assessment Methodology, or RAM, is a methodology developed by DEFRA large producers must use to assess the recyclability of household packaging and packaging that commonly ends up in public bins that are placed on the UK market. And this is to fulfil their recyclability assessment obligation. Now, the RAM evaluates packaging recyclability through 5 stages, and I will go on to talk about those in a minute, but that is inclusive of classification, so classifying the packaging material, its components, collection, so how that packaging is collected from curbside or whether that's another alternative route, sortation, so how those materials, those packaging waste materials are sorted, reprocessing, so the recycling of those packaging materials once they've gone into separate material streams, and then the application, so what happens to that recycler once it's been recycled, what products can we put it into. And the RAM will categorise packaging components as either red, amber or green for recyclability. And this RAM methodology will be reviewed and updated annually, because we know that packaging recyclability isn't a definite definition. It's constantly changing, it's dynamic. Due to innovations in the market, we've got evolving conditions and regulatory changes that sort of stipulate what is considered as recyclable. So like simpler recycling, which has just been announced, just implemented from the 1st of April. Things like that will change how a packaging item is viewed and whether it's recyclable or not. So just a reminder as well that today we are talking about RAM version 1, but DEFRA are expected to publish a revised methodology, so RAM version 1.1, and associated guidance and a change log to the mid to end of April. So this month, April 2025, we're expecting to see a new version of the RAM methodology. So the assessment output, we've kind of already touched that it will be red, amber and green. But once you've carried out that assessment, you'll obviously end up with an output for that household packaging or packaging that commonly ends in public bins. Red packaging has specifications that make it very difficult to recycle at scale. Amber packaging may experience challenges during collection or sortation and might require specialist infrastructure for reprocessing. The efficiency and output quality of the reprocessing is affected, and there might be some secondary material loss. So, we can potentially maybe handle this packaging, but not always. It might require a specific route. And then green is widely recycled under the current UK infrastructure. So that packaging is widely collected. We know it can be reprocessed, and we know it's going back into packaging that we use day to day. Full details of how those disposal fees will be modulated on these assessment outputs has been shared for the first time this week, as I said, and I will go over that in a couple of slides so you'll understand what is meant by red, amber and green in terms of fees. So we have some high-level instructions, really. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the RAM yet. Obviously, the first data reporting for large producers will be the 1st of October because it's alongside with your biannual submission. But as we mentioned, large producers are required to complete a recyclability assessment for every item of packaging or component that they place on the UK market that is deemed to be household packaging or packaging that commonly ends up in public bins. So the key steps that you're going to need to take is to separate out that household packaging and packaging that commonly ends up in public bins from your other packaging. So removing non-household packaging because this doesn't need to be assessed. You then need to follow the RAM, carrying out the recyclability assessment on this packaging. And you'll see the links in this PowerPoint will take you through to the DEFRA gov.uk guidance page. But it is essentially a step-by-step methodology that you would follow to complete for each packaging component to make sure you got the output. You then report that output of the assessment for all items and components within your biannual placed on market data submissions. And this should either be a red, amber or green rating. So really straightforward. You've either got 3 options once you've completed that methodology. And then it is recommended that you retain your records of any recyclability assessment outputs and evidence to support that. So that might be packaging specifications, information on invoices, it might be information over an email direct from the supplier, that you've arrived at that output, and that needs to be saved for at least 7 years after the date of submission. So it's slightly longer than previously how data was meant to be stored. And I think for a lot of people, the RAM can be quite daunting because I know a lot of producers have a large number of SKUs and lots of packaging components. But in terms of once you've completed that, for one packaging component. If you know you've got packaging items across other SKUs that have the same specifications, you know you've already completed that process for that product, or for that packaging component rather. So you can then just obviously use results if it's for the same components. And I think although we're saying that the RAM will be updated and we're obviously waiting on an update, but that's kind of because it's a new process. Once we've got this established in place, the RAM will be updated every year, but they'll obviously acknowledge which which parts have been updated, and you'll then be able to identify which parts within packaging assessments will then need to be reviewed. So it's not like you're going to have to redo it every single year. It might be little bits that you might have to pick up and redo. So just to go in a bit more detail of those five stages of the recycling process and what is really being considered, I just thought it'd be helpful to go through. So the first one is classification, and that is obviously how you classify the packaging components. So packaging components that can be separated by hand should obviously be assessed separately. And packaging components that are separated during the product use and then not put back together or not reassembled should also be reported separately. So that's like a tear off strip on a piece of shipment packaging, you know, your Amazon box, when you tear it open, that tear off strip is then separated, so should be assessed separately. Or when you open a bottle of wine, that cork is now separate from that bottle. But things like a laundry detergent bottle, where you've got a lid that might come off and on, when the consumer is throwing that away, it's likely that the lid will be placed back on. So that can be considered as one component together, the lid and bottle. And we'll go on to talk about that in a bit more detail. Multi-material packaging, where components cannot easily be separated, so maybe thinking about laminates and things like that, should be assessed under the predominant material by weight. And where a material or whole unit is undefinable in material categories, it should be assessed within the other material packaging category. So you should follow the RAM for other. So once you've classified your packaging component or packaging unit or whatever. Also, sorry, I haven't even mentioned, for drinks containers, they will also be reported as a whole component. So one drinks bottle and its components should be assessed as a whole. And that's because of DRS and how that will evolve, but we're not going to touch on that too much today. Collection. So the second phase is collection, and that measures how well packaging components can be collected. So this is essentially defined by WRAP. So widely collected represents waste packaging collected by 75% or more of local authorities in the UK. So that is generally considered as widely collected. You know, we see a lot of things like this, like bottles, pots, tubs and trays, paper and board, that kind of thing we know is easily collected from a lot of households. Where limited collection represents packaging waste collected from curbsides of 50% or less of local authorities collecting that. So that might be slightly niche packaging, things like flexibles. It doesn't have a good collection system through the UK at the moment, so that would be considered as a limited collection. There is also consideration of take-back schemes, and this is also considered as an alternative route for collection, but if you're using this in the RAM, you have to make sure to check that it is defined as a take-back scheme that the government acknowledges. So it's obviously not restricted to one brand. It is accessible to at least 75% of the UK population. You have no conflict with local authority collections. It doesn't require the consumer to purchase the item beforehand, and that you can fully demonstrate transparency of which material is being collected and where that goes. So it's always worthwhile checking that. The third element of the recycling process that is considered is a measurement of how well packaging components are sorted. And so packaging waste is sorted either by hand at curbside by the consumer or at a material recovery facility, so allowing sortation at scale, which is kind of the focus of this methodology. They're kind of assuming that most things are coming in sort of mixed dry recyclables. And the sortation involves the process of capturing and diverting packaging waste into the appropriate waste streams for then further processing down the supply chain. And the efficiency of sortation can be impacted by a magnitude of considerations, such as design choices and specifications, material shape, size, density, colour. So there's lots of considerations there, and this is all captured within the RAM. The fourth phase is reprocessing, and that's sorted post-consumer packaging material. It's been collected, it's been sorted. We've now got sort of, you can imagine, a big bin full of the same material is then sent for reprocessing into recycler. So as you can imagine, you don't recycle steel in the same way you recycle paper. So each material type requires specific processing technologies, and certain contaminants can disrupt the process or lower the quality of the recycled materials. The tolerance for contaminants varies by material and process, with different items and substances prohibited in each reprocessing method. And then the final consideration is application, and that's really a measurement of how well the output material can be reused and used in products. So it really refers to factors which may affect the quality of recyclate being produced, or causing unnecessary secondary material loss in that recycling process. So that is sort of really, in terms of recycling, it's defined as any recovery process in which materials are reprocessed into products, materials, or substances. So it measures the effectiveness of what happens there. Now, that was a lot of words, and I actually am quite a visual person, so I much prefer this decision tree. It was published back in December 2024, so it might be slightly outdated now, but it does give you that process of one, you can see at the top on the left there, classification. If it's widely collected, you can go to yes. Sortation, if it's widely collected, yes, it goes on to reprocessing and then on to application. You can see no, the different routes that it might go down to get red or amber. So there are some packaging materials that are automatically classified as red. And these components are massively problematic and cannot be recycled. They'll cause issues in the sorting process, maybe. They might introduce contaminants into certain material streams and definitely can cause unnecessary secondary material loss. And packaging that contains any of the following must automatically be classed as red. So that's 4 to consider. Number 1 is anything really with electrical, that's not a word, electrical components, or batteries. So anything really that's classified as E, which is electrical and electronic equipment. We have substances of very high concern, listed by UK REACH. So anything like that is within packaging should definitely be an automatic red. We've got inks manufactured in compliance with the exclusion policy for printing inks and related products. So something to look into with the inks. And then any intentionally added, now I'm not even going to try and pronounce those words, PFAS, essentially. So anything that's intentionally added from those lists. Then we sort of have packaging for which you have insufficient evidence. So if you cannot provide evidence for any part of the RAM or have incomplete data about a packaging item or component, you must then automatically class that as red as well. So we wanted to kind of run through a bit of an example. We've got a laundry liquid bottle here, so a laundry detergent bottle. And this bottle consists of a PP plastic bottle and a PP plastic cap. And we've got a PE sleeve that is perforated. You can see my lovely diagram there with the perforation. And there's clear instructions for the consumer of how to remove. As the sleeve can be easily removed from the bottle, this can be assessed separately. And it's important to note as well, the cap as an undersized component, it can be attached to the bottle by the consumer to meet the size threshold. And so therefore, in this scenario, the bottle and cap should be assessed together as a single component. So we've kind of already done that classification. So we know that the bottle and lid would be assessed together. And then we know that the sleeve would fall, is easily removable. So it would fall as a secondary component, something to assess separately. So The bottle and cap would fall into rigid plastics. It's listed as a common example, bottle, for rigid plastics, so we note that, whereas the sleeve would fall into flexible plastics, as it's listed again as a common example of a flexible, and we know that it's made from a polyolefin plastic such as PE. Going on to collection, according to the RAM methodology, we know that plastic bottles are collected by 100% of local authorities. So with the bottle, we can move on to the next stage. For the sleeve, currently in the UK, we have very low collection rates. I think it's at about 14%. I think RAM confirms that. However, there are supermarket take-back schemes available. So you often see a flexible collection in sort of the front door of Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Asda. And so that meets the criteria outlined by RAM. So we can classify the sleeve as amber. And you can see there on the right-hand side of the table, the RAM output is amber. Now, best practice would be to continue the RAM until the end of the methodology. So you have that kind of information recorded internally. And if there's any changes, if then flexible suddenly became recyclable in the UK, you then already have the information recorded about the next step. So you wouldn't necessarily have to go back and change massive or redo the method. However, for the purpose of this example, we're going to stop there with the sleeve. But we moved on to sortation for the bottle and cap. And the sleeve has already been removed, so there's no impact from that in terms of sorting. And the bottle isn't black, which again, is not causing any problems in sorting. We know that cap is below the 40mm in 2 dimensions threshold, but because it's attached to the bottle, we know that it is going to be fine and it will move on as a green to the next stage. So then we're going on to reprocessing, and the PP bottle and cap do not contain any PVDC barriers or coatings. The cap isn't steel, aluminium, PS or PVC. There's no attached label, that's already been removed, so that's fine. And there's no inserts comprised of PVC, PS, PU, PA, PET, PC, PMMA, thermoplastics, the list goes on. So we know that we can pass on to the next phase. And then we finally reach step 5, which is the application. And the bottle doesn't have any opaque or heavy colours. It doesn't have any PA barriers or coatings. It doesn't have any clarifier additives. It doesn't have any attached sleeves or labels, that's already come off, and doesn't have any inserts either. So we know that bottle is therefore and cap, because we're assessing them together, as green. And you can see there on the final row how it would be reported in the biannual submission. So plastic equals green again for the cap, and then we've got the plastic equals amber. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how it's applied, and the full round guidance is there in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So I did promise we'd touch on this new update that's come in this week. So on April the 1st, in the Circular Economy Joint Stakeholder Forum, Pack UK presented the first look at potential modulated fees for the coming years. And Pack UK are keen to stress that this is not meant to be punishing for producers. A modulation is meant to incentivise producers to use recyclable materials in their packaging, making sure that resultant fees reduce the risk of producers switching their packaging to materials to less sustainable or less recyclable materials. Sorry. So for the red materials, they will face a percentage uplift in fees, and that's consistent across all packaging materials. For amber, this first view has listed the amber packaging materials will be set as the base fee, so it's almost a neutral cost. And then the green will have all the fees raised from the red packaging uplift will be distributed across all packaging materials to give a discount for green packaging materials. So green will have a reduced fee, whereas red will be up, but that red up will fund the green down, essentially. So this might mean, because it's across all packaging materials, that a red plastic bottle, if it was made out of a bad material, could then potentially contribute to a decrease in glass fee if the glass was defined as green. And obviously, this is very new and still subject to change. And PAC UK expect to publish the final policy statement in June 2025, along with the final base fees as well. So June is when we're going to get that big update. Now, I did pull across some of those examples, sorry, into a illustrative sort of table here with a cost estimate. Now, again, I must remind, this is obviously the first publication of the RAM fee modulation framework, and we're expecting these figures to change, but I just wanted to provide a bit of a estimate for producers. So we can see for each material category, we've got an illustrative disposal base fee rate. And these are the third iteration of the illustrative fees, which came out just before Christmas. So they're again expected to change. And then we've got the estimated green disposal fee. For the purpose of this model here, we're just multiplying it by 0.925 as an example. We've got the amber, which would then obviously be just the same as the base fee. It's a neutral. And then you can see three scenarios on the right-hand side of different red rates. So we've got potentially, DEFRA have said maybe in 2026, it would be a 1.2 uplift. Going into 2027, that might increase to 1.6. And then even by 2028, we might be at a doubling, so a two-fold factor. Now, you can see as well that wood and other don't have a figure, and that's because there's no green. The green column for wood and other doesn't have a rate, and that's because there's no green examples listed in with the RAM. But I think it's just nice to see this as an example. And I think when you compare it to European modulated fees, 2026, that 1.2 is actually quite average, whereas the 2 times is probably quite ambitious. So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, this is just that first estimate, first publication, and it is likely to change going forward. So just a good example of how the fees may look. So top tips for increasing the recyclability of your packaging. So obviously, where possible, aiming for monomaterial formats. And that might be aiming for sort of main material being more than 90% of the component weight. So we know that it's pretty much one material. That might be in like actuators and pumps, trying to aim for different alternative solutions. You're removing like little metal components, things like that. But yeah, aiming for monomaterials is the best approach. And it improves the sort of recyclability in terms of that end process, because you're not having to separate lots of different materials. I think you should also aim to continue to monitor what materials are widely recycled within our system. So we know that flexibles at the moment aren't currently collected, but hopefully by 2027, all being well, they will start to be collected from households. So you know that maybe by then we'll be okay. For things like small components, we have definitely seen tethering or take-back solutions becoming more popular, and I'm assuming they will become more under RAM. But it just means they're being captured within the sortation process and they're not being lost out of the system. Obviously, as well, a big recommendation is to avoid significantly sized labels or sleeves, aiming for less than 60% of packaging component size. And I think that does depend on material, so maybe even to 40% as well, as a big focus. And then for things like fibre-based composites and paper and board, really minimising lamination to one side and below 10% of the packaging component weight. And I think the Confederation of Paper Industries even recommend 5%, so even lower if that's possible. And again, Beyondly can help assess your packaging and look at the recyclability to help reduce those fees under the RAM and the new modulation. So in terms of the long-term evolution of RAM, we know that within the producer responsibility regulations, that EPR regulation, There are other factors that are considered for household packaging, so that hasn't been acknowledged just yet, but there's the capacity for it to be brought in. So for packaging, it's assessing whether it might be reusable, the extent to whether packaging is reused. Obviously, the recyclability of packaging, and that is already being captured. Any other environmental impacts of the manufacturing or the transportation, and then finally as well, the environmental impact of when that becomes waste. And at that recent Circular Economy Joint Stakeholder Forum, PAC UK did note that RAM would only be so the recyclability assessment would only be the basis for fee modulation for the first 3 years. So there's huge potential for other sustainability factors to be considered long term after that first 3 years of modulation. So again, something to be wary of, always thinking of innovative ways that you can support your packaging being reduced. Can you maybe look at some innovative reuse cycle and just really help to reduce the environmental of your packaging across the whole portfolio. Obviously with recyclability as a focus initially, but long term considering other factors as well. So some key takeaways. Obviously, large producers have the obligation to assess that recyclability of household packaging and packaging that ends up in commonly ends up in public bins. The first recyclability assessment methodology will be assessed from January to June 2025 and then submitted from October 2025. And the outputs will inform fee modulation from 2026 to 2027 in terms of those disposal fees, but it does apply to packaging being placed on the market this year. And then that we are looking to see an updated version of the RAM methodology, so version 1.1, being published later on this month. And then finally, that we've had a sneak peek of that first draft of the disposal fee modulation framework. And it's helpful to see how potentially modulation will be applied to those RAM outputs, the red, amber, green, and those potential fees. But again, we are still waiting for further clarification on this, and PAC UK are expected to provide that final policy statement and base fee in June 2025. So those figures are still very much subject to change, but just helpful for producers to start thinking about potential costs they face. So thank you so much for joining. Hopefully you feel a bit more confident about RAM and modulation. If you have any questions or you're interested in the services that Beyondly offer, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you.